5 women mysteriously pregnant in prison. What the doctor did will infuriate you. Ravensbrück Penitentiary, a sprawling complex of concrete and steel, stood isolated amidst the desolate plains of eastern Colorado. It was a women's correctional facility, housing inmates convicted of crimes ranging from petty theft to violent offenses. The high walls, topped with razor wire, and the imposing guard towers cast long shadows, both literally and figuratively, over the lives of those within. The atmosphere inside Ravensbrück was one of controlled tension, a constant undercurrent of fear and resentment simmering beneath a veneer of enforced order. The daily routine was rigid, regimented, and relentlessly monotonous. Wake-up calls at dawn, followed by head counts, bland meals in the crowded cafeteria, work assignments in the laundry or the kitchen, and then more head counts, more enforced silence, more crushing monotony. Among the inmates were a diverse group of women, each with their own story, their own regrets, their own hopes for survival. There was Maria, a young Latina woman serving time for drug possession, her spirit not yet broken by the harsh realities of prison life. She dreamed of reuniting with her young son, who was being cared for by her mother. There was Sarah, a middle-aged woman convicted of embezzlement, her quiet demeanor masking a sharp intelligence and a deep sense of shame. She had made a mistake, a terrible mistake, and she was paying the price. There was Keisha, a tough, street-smart woman serving time for assault, her bravado a shield against the vulnerability she felt inside. She had learned to survive in a harsh world, and prison was just another battleground. There was Emily, a petite, bookish woman convicted of fraud, her gentle nature ill-suited to the brutal realities of prison life. She found solace in the prison library, losing herself in books, escaping the grim reality of her surroundings. And there was Jessica, a young woman with a history of mental health issues, serving time for a crime she barely remembered committing. She was often confused, disoriented, her mind a fragile vessel in a sea of chaos. These 5 women, along with hundreds of others, lived under the watchful eye of Chief Warden Harold Andrew. He was a career corrections officer, a man who believed in strict discipline and unwavering control. He ran Ravensbrück with an iron fist, his rules absolute, his punishments swift and severe. He saw the inmates not as individuals, but as numbers, problems to be managed, threats to be contained. He was a stocky man with a square head, the few hairs that he got are gray and neatly combed. He was supported by a staff of correctional officers, some of whom shared his harsh views, others who were simply trying to do their jobs and survive the day. There were also medical personnel, counselors, and administrative staff, all operating within the rigid hierarchy of the prison system. Among the medical staff was Dr. Edward Ramirez, the prison physician. He was a quiet, unassuming man, his demeanor cold and detached. He seemed to view the inmates as specimens, subjects for study, rather than as human beings in need of care. He rarely spoke, his actions perfunctory, his eyes devoid of empathy. The walls of Ravensbrück were not just physical barriers. There were also walls of silence, walls of fear, walls of despair. They contained stories of pain, of loss, of regret, but also stories of resilience, of hope, of the enduring human spirit. And within those walls, a terrifying secret was about to unfold, a secret that would shatter the fragile equilibrium of the prison and expose the dark underbelly of a system designed to punish, not to heal. The stage was set, the characters introduced, and the ominous atmosphere of Ravensbrück Penitentiary established, foreshadowing the horrors to come. The first sign was subtle, almost imperceptible. Maria, usually energetic and quick-witted, started experiencing bouts of nausea and fatigue. She initially dismissed it as a stomach bug, something that was going around the prison. But the symptoms persisted, and she began to feel a growing sense of unease. Then, Sarah, the quiet, bookish woman, started complaining of similar ailments. She, too, felt nauseous, tired, and strangely bloated. She attributed it to the poor quality of the prison food, the stress of incarceration, the lack of proper nutrition. But when Keisha, the tough, street-smart inmate, started experiencing the same symptoms, the whispers began. Keisha was not one to complain, not one to show weakness. She had always prided herself on her strength, her ability to endure anything. But she couldn't deny the changes in her body, the queasiness, the exhaustion, the strange swelling in her abdomen. The whispers spread through the cell blocks, the cafeteria, the laundry room. The women, initially hesitant to voice their fears, began to share their concerns, their suspicions, their growing sense of dread. "It's the food," some said. "They're putting something in the food." "It's the water," others whispered. "It's contaminated." "It's the meds," a few suggested, referring to the various medications dispensed by Dr. Ramirez. "He's experimenting on us." The most unthinkable explanation, the one that no one dared to voice openly, was the possibility of pregnancy. But that was impossible, wasn't it? They were in a women's prison, isolated from men. They were subjected to regular searches, their bodies scrutinized, their privacy violated. How could they possibly be pregnant? Yet, the symptoms were undeniable. The nausea, the fatigue, the missed periods, the growing bellies. The evidence was mounting, and the fear was growing, spreading like a virus through the prison population. The prison staff, initially dismissive of the inmates' complaints, began to take notice. Warden Andrew, informed of the situation by his deputies, ordered Dr. Ramirez to conduct medical examinations of the affected women. Dr. Ramirez, his face impassive, his demeanor cold and clinical, performed the examinations, confirming the unthinkable. Maria, Sarah, Keisha, and 2 other inmates, Emily and Jessica, were pregnant. The news sent shockwaves through Ravensbrück. The inmates were stunned, terrified, and outraged. The staff was bewildered, confused, and deeply concerned. Warden Andrew was furious, his control threatened, his authority challenged. He immediately ordered an internal investigation, demanding to know how such a thing could have happened. He interrogated the correctional officers, the medical staff, anyone who might have had contact with the pregnant inmates. He suspected a breach of security, a conspiracy, a deliberate attempt to undermine his authority. But the investigation yielded no answers. There was no evidence of any male intrusion into the prison, no sign of any illicit contact between the inmates and the outside world. The pregnancies remained a mystery, an inexplicable phenomenon that defied logic and reason. Warden Andrew, desperate to contain the situation, ordered the pregnant inmates to be isolated, placed in solitary confinement, ostensibly for their own protection. He imposed a strict lockdown on the entire prison, restricting movement, limiting communication, and increasing surveillance. The whispers turned into shouts. The fear turned into panic. The inmates, already living under a regime of control and oppression, now felt even more vulnerable, more threatened. They knew something was terribly wrong, that they were being lied to, that their bodies were no longer their own. The walls of Ravensbrück, already thick with secrets and silence, had become a breeding ground for fear, suspicion, and a growing sense of dread. The unthinkable had happened, and the truth, whatever it might be, was far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. The first signs of pregnancy, initially dismissed as minor ailments, had triggered a chain reaction, exposing the dark underbelly of a system built on control and secrecy. The routine checkups were anything but. They were conducted by Dr. Ramirez in a small, sterile examination room, devoid of any warmth or comfort. The inmates were summoned one by one, their names called out over the loudspeaker, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and apprehension. They were ordered to strip down, to put on flimsy paper gowns, to submit to Dr. Ramirez's cold, impersonal examination. He rarely spoke, his eyes avoiding theirs, his touch clinical and detached. He performed the examinations quickly, efficiently, as if he were dealing with objects, not human beings. The key component of these checkups was an injection administered by Dr. Ramirez with a swift, practice motion. He told the inmates it was a vitamin shot, a booster, something to improve their overall health. The inmates, accustomed to obeying orders, to submitting to authority, rarely questioned the procedure. They were afraid to speak out, afraid to challenge the doctor, afraid of the consequences. They had learned, through bitter experience, that resistance was futile, that questioning authority only led to punishment. Some of the inmates, however, felt a deep sense of unease. Maria, despite her fear, noticed the way Dr. Ramirez avoided her gaze, the way his hands trembled slightly as he prepared the injection. She felt a prickling sensation on her skin, a sense of foreboding that she couldn't quite explain. Sarah, with her sharp intelligence, questioned the need for these vitamin shots. She had never heard of such a thing before, and she couldn't understand why they were being administered to all the inmates, regardless of their health status. She tried to ask Dr. Ramirez about the contents of the injection, but he brushed her off, dismissing her concerns with a curt, "It's for your own good." Keisha, with her street smarts and her inherent distrust of authority, openly challenged Dr. Ramirez. She refused the injection, demanding to know what was in it, what it was for. Dr. Ramirez simply stared at her, his eyes cold and unyielding. Two correctional officers stepped forward, restraining Keisha, forcing her to submit to the injection. Emily, with her gentle nature and her bookish ways, was terrified. She tried to reason with Dr. Ramirez, explaining that she was allergic to certain medications, that she needed to know what he was injecting her with. But he ignored her pleas, dismissing her concerns as hysteria. Jessica, with her fragile mental state, was completely overwhelmed. She didn't understand what was happening, why she was being forced to undergo this procedure. She cried, she pleaded, she begged them to stop. But her cries were ignored, her pleas unheard. The injections were administered quickly, efficiently, and without any regard for the inmates' feelings, their fears, their basic human rights. Dr. Ramirez, acting under the orders of Warden Andrew, was carrying out a secret, sinister agenda, an agenda that would have devastating consequences for the women of Ravensbrück. The routine checkups were a carefully orchestrated deception, a cover for the forced administration of synthetic hormones, a violation of the inmates' bodies, their trust, their very humanity. The walls of Ravensbrück, already thick with secrets, were now stained with the indelible mark of this unspeakable crime. And the women, trapped within those walls, were powerless to resist, their voices silenced, their bodies controlled, their futures uncertain. The medical procedures, presented as a benevolent act of care, were in reality a cruel and calculated act of manipulation, a key component in a conspiracy that was about to unravel. The following weeks were a blur of confusion, fear, and growing dread for the 5 women. The vitamin shots had ceased, but the changes in their bodies continued, inexorably, undeniably. Their breasts became tender and swollen. Their abdomens began to protrude. Their periods stopped completely. The whispers and rumors within the prison intensified, fueled by a mixture of morbid curiosity and genuine concern. The other inmates, though initially skeptical, could no longer deny the obvious. Maria, Sarah, Keisha, Emily, and Jessica were pregnant. But how? The question echoed through the cell blocks, the cafeteria, the laundry room. It was a question that no one could answer, a mystery that defied logic and reason. Maria, driven by a desperate need to understand what was happening to her, started to keep a detailed journal, documenting her symptoms, her thoughts, her fears. She noticed a pattern, a correlation between the routine checkups and the onset of her pregnancy symptoms. She shared her suspicions with Sarah, whose sharp mind quickly grasped the implications. "It's the injections, Maria," Sarah said, her voice low and urgent. "Dr. Ramirez, he did something to us. He made us pregnant." The realization hit them like a physical blow. It was unthinkable, monstrous, but it was the only explanation that made sense. They had been deliberately, systematically violated. They decided to confide in Keisha, knowing that her street smarts and her inherent distrust of authority would be invaluable. Keisha, initially skeptical, listened to their story, her eyes narrowing with anger. "That son of a bitch," she growled. "He's gonna pay for this. We're all gonna make him pay." Together, the three women decided to approach Emily and Jessica, bringing them into their confidence. Emily, though initially terrified, agreed to join their cause. Jessica, however, was too confused, too disoriented to fully grasp the situation. They vowed to protect her, to speak for her, to include her in their fight for justice. The five women, bound together by their shared trauma and their determination to expose the truth, began to gather evidence. They meticulously documented their symptoms, their conversations with Dr. Ramirez, their observations of the routine checkups. They collected scraps of paper, smuggled out notes, and whispered their story to trusted inmates, hoping to find someone who could help them. But their efforts were met with resistance, with fear, with silence. Most of the inmates were too afraid to speak out, too afraid of the consequences. The prison staff, under the strict control of Warden Andrew, dismissed their complaints as hysteria, delusions, attempts to cause trouble. The pregnant women were increasingly isolated, subjected to constant surveillance, their movements restricted, their communication monitored. They were treated as pariahs, as troublemakers, as threats to the order and stability of the prison. The panic began to set in. They were trapped, surrounded by enemies, with no one to turn to. They were carrying babies they hadn't conceived naturally, babies they didn't know how to care for, babies whose very existence was a testament to the horrific violation they had endured. But even in the midst of their despair, a flicker of hope remained. They had each other. They had their shared experience, their shared anger, their shared determination to fight for justice. They would not be silenced. They would not be defeated. They would find a way to expose the truth, to hold those responsible accountable, to reclaim their bodies, their lives, and their dignity. The truth had emerged. The horrifying reality of their situation had been confirmed, and the panic, though intense, was also a catalyst, a driving force that would propel them forward on their perilous journey towards justice. Warden Andrew, a man accustomed to absolute control, felt his grip on Ravensbrück slipping. The undeniable pregnancies among the five inmates had ignited a firestorm of rumors and speculation, threatening to expose his carefully constructed facade of order and discipline. He knew he had to act quickly, decisively, to contain the situation, to silence the dissent, to protect his career and his reputation. He convened an emergency meeting with his senior staff, including Dr. Ramirez and the head of security, Captain Miller. The atmosphere in the room was tense, fraught with anxiety and barely concealed panic. "This situation is spiraling out of control," Andrew said, his voice harsh and demanding. "The inmates are talking, the rumors are spreading. We need to shut this down now." Dr. Ramirez, his face pale and drawn, shifted uneasily in his chair. "Warden," he said, his voice hesitant, "perhaps we should consider—" Andrew cut him off, his eyes blazing with anger. "Consider what, doctor?" he snapped. "Confessing? Admitting our mistake? That's not an option. We're in too deep." Captain Miller, a burly man with a shaved head and a menacing demeanor, spoke up. "We need to isolate the pregnant inmates," he said. "Put them in solitary. Control the narrative. Make it clear that they're the problem, not us." Andrew nodded, his mind racing. "Agreed," he said. "We'll implement a full lockdown. No movement, no communication, no visitors. We'll claim it's for their own protection, to prevent the spread of a contagious illness, something that explains the symptoms." He turned to Dr. Ramirez. "Doctor, you will prepare a statement confirming the presence of a rare virus, something that causes hormonal imbalances, something that mimics pregnancy. Make it sound convincing." Ramirez hesitated, his conscience flickering faintly. "But Warden," he said, that's a lie. It's unethical. It's necessary," Andrew interrupted, his voice cold and implacable. "Do as you're told, doctor." or face the consequences. Ramirez, trapped by his own complicity, his own fear, nodded silently. He knew he was trapped, that he had crossed a line from which there was no return. The lockdown was implemented swiftly and brutally. The inmates were confined to their cells, their movements restricted, their contact with the outside world severed. The pregnant women were moved to solitary confinement, isolated and alone, their cries for help ignored. Warden Andrew, through carefully crafted statements to the press and to the Prison Oversight Board, painted a picture of a contained medical crisis, a rare and unfortunate outbreak of a mysterious illness. He assured everyone that the situation was under control, that the affected inmates were receiving the best possible care, and that there was no cause for alarm. But within the walls of Ravensbrück, the reality was far different. The pregnant inmates, deprived of their support network, their friends, their meager comforts, were subjected to further abuse and intimidation. They were interrogated repeatedly, pressured to recant their stories, to admit that they had somehow orchestrated their own pregnancies. They were denied access to proper medical care, their complaints of pain and discomfort dismissed as attention-seeking behavior. They were subjected to constant surveillance, their every move monitored, their every word recorded. The other inmates, though confined to their cells, were not silent. They knew something was terribly wrong, that their sisters were being punished for a crime they hadn't committed. They whispered their support, shared their meager rations, and devised ways to communicate with the isolated women, tapping on walls, passing notes through cracks in the doors, maintaining a fragile network of solidarity. But the fear was palpable, the sense of oppression overwhelming. Warden Andrew's iron fist had tightened its grip on Ravensbrück, crushing any dissent, silencing any opposition, enforcing a reign of terror designed to protect his secret and maintain his control. The cover-up was in full swing, a desperate attempt to bury the truth beneath a mountain of lies and intimidation. But the seeds of resistance had been sown, the whispers of dissent were growing louder, and the courage of a few brave women, along with an outsider, would soon challenge the iron walls of Ravensbrück and the darkness that lay within. The lockdown and retaliation were only temporary measures, delaying the inevitable confrontation, the ultimate reckoning that was to come. Anna Petrova, a registered nurse, had worked at Ravensbrück Penitentiary for 5 years. She was a quiet, compassionate woman, dedicated to her profession and committed to providing the best possible care to the inmates. She had seen a lot in her time at Ravensbrück, the harsh realities of prison life, the violence, the despair, the systemic injustices. But she had always maintained her professionalism, her empathy, her belief in the inherent dignity of every human being. She had a good memory. She remembered every patient's medical history. She had been increasingly troubled by the recent events at the prison, the sudden pregnancies, the lockdown, the isolation of the affected inmates. She had initially accepted the official explanation, the story of a rare virus, but something didn't feel right. There were inconsistencies, unanswered questions, a nagging sense of unease that she couldn't shake. Her suspicions were further aroused when she was denied access to the medical records of the pregnant inmates. She had requested the files, citing her need to understand their medical history in order to provide appropriate care. But her request had been denied by Dr. Ramirez, who claimed that the records were confidential and under review. This was highly unusual. Nurses routinely access patient records. It was a necessary part of their job. Dr. Ramirez's refusal to release the files raised a red flag, confirming Anna's growing suspicion that something was being hidden. She decided to conduct her own discreet investigation. She started by reviewing the medical records of other inmates, looking for any patterns, any anomalies, any clues that might shed light on the situation. She spent hours poring over charts, comparing lab results, analyzing medication logs. She discovered a disturbing pattern. All 5 of the pregnant inmates had received the same vitamin shot administered by Dr. Ramirez during the so-called routine checkups. And these checkups had all occurred within a relatively short period of time. She also noticed discrepancies in the medication logs. The records showed that the pregnant inmates had been prescribed prenatal vitamins and other supplements, but there was no record of any medication that could have caused their pregnancies. In fact, there was no record of any medications being administered during those particular checkups. Anna felt a chill run down her spine. The evidence was circumstantial, but it was compelling. It pointed to a deliberate, systematic effort to induce pregnancy in these women and a subsequent cover-up to conceal the truth. She knew she had to do something, but she was also afraid. She knew that speaking out against Warden Andrew and Dr. Ramirez could have serious consequences. She could lose her job, her career, even her freedom. She confided in a trusted colleague, a fellow nurse named Susan, a different Susan. Susan was initially skeptical, but as Anna presented the evidence, her skepticism turned to shock and outrage. "Anna, this is unbelievable," Susan said. "We have to report this. We have to tell someone." "Who?" Anna asked. "Who can we trust? Warden Andrew controls everything. Dr. Ramirez is his puppet. The other staff, they're either complicit or too afraid to speak out." Susan thought for a moment. "There's a lawyer," she said. "Gabriel Carter. He's a human rights lawyer. He's taken on cases like this before, cases of prison abuse. He's fearless." Anna felt a flicker of hope. Gabriel Carter. She had heard of him, read about his work. He had a reputation for being a tenacious advocate for the voiceless, a champion of justice. She decided to take the risk. She gathered all the evidence she had collected, the discrepancies in the medical records, the witness testimonies from other inmates, her own observations and suspicions. She carefully documented everything, making copies, storing them in a safe place. Then, she contacted Gabriel Carter. She left a message on his voicemail, explaining her situation, her suspicions, her fear. She didn't know if he would believe her, if he would take her case. But she had to try. Anna's suspicions, initially a whisper of unease, had grown into a roar of conviction. She had stumbled upon a dark secret, a horrifying truth, and she was determined to expose it, no matter the cost. Her courage, her compassion, and her unwavering commitment to her patients had transformed her from a quiet, unassuming nurse into a whistleblower, a potential catalyst for change, a glimmer of hope in the oppressive darkness of Ravensbrück Penitentiary. The next step, reaching out to Gabriel Carter, was a leap of faith, a desperate attempt to bring justice to the wronged and to hold the powerful accountable. Gabriel Carter listened to Anna Petrova's voicemail message with a growing sense of disbelief and outrage. He was a seasoned human rights lawyer with over 20 years of experience fighting for the rights of the marginalized, the oppressed, the forgotten. He had taken on powerful corporations, corrupt governments, and abusive institutions. He had seen the worst of humanity, the depths of cruelty and depravity. But this was something different. A prison deliberately inducing pregnancies in female inmates? It sounded like something out of a dystopian novel, a nightmare scenario that defied belief. Yet, there was something in Anna's voice, a desperate sincerity, a palpable fear that convinced him to take her seriously. He immediately returned her call, arranging a meeting at a discreet location, a small coffee shop far from Ravensbrück Penitentiary. He knew that Anna was taking a huge risk by contacting him, that she could face severe retaliation if her actions were discovered. When they met, Anna was visibly nervous, her hands trembling as she handed him a thick folder filled with documents. "This is everything I could gather," she said, her voice low and urgent. "Medical records, medication logs, witness testimonies. It's all there. The discrepancies, the patterns, the lies." Gabriel spent hours reviewing the documents, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was impressed by Anna's thoroughness, her attention to detail, her courage in gathering this evidence. He saw the clear pattern of forced medical procedures, the inconsistencies in the official reports, the deliberate attempts to cover up the truth. He also saw the human cost of this conspiracy, the fear and suffering of the pregnant inmates, the systemic abuse of power, the blatant disregard for human rights. "Anna," he said, his voice filled with conviction, I believe you, and I will help you. We will expose this, and we will bring those responsible to justice." Anna felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had found an ally, a powerful advocate, someone who believed her, someone who was willing to fight for her and for the women of Ravensbrück. Gabriel Carter immediately assembled his legal team, a group of dedicated lawyers and investigators who shared his passion for justice. They began working around the clock, analyzing the evidence, interviewing witnesses, and preparing a legal strategy. Their first step was to obtain a court order, granting them access to Ravensbrück Penitentiary and the medical records of the pregnant inmates. They knew that Warden Andrew would resist, that he would try to obstruct their investigation, but they were prepared for a fight. They also contacted the media, leaking the story to a select group of investigative journalists, including Sarah Matthews, who had been working with Father John on the St. Benedict case. They knew that public pressure would be crucial to their success, that exposing the scandal to the light of day would force the authorities to act. The story broke like a thunderclap, sending shockwaves through the nation. The headlines were sensational, the allegations horrifying. Pregnant prisoners, forced medical experimentation at Ravensbrück Penitentiary, warden accused of cover-up, abuse of power. Human rights lawyer files lawsuit against prison. The public outcry was immediate and intense. Human rights organizations, women's rights groups, and civil liberties advocates condemned the alleged abuses, demanding a full and independent investigation. Politicians called for hearings, investigations, and reforms. Warden Andrew, caught completely off guard by the sudden explosion of media attention, vehemently denied the allegations. He claimed that the pregnancies were the result of consensual relationships between inmates, a blatant lie that was quickly debunked by the evidence. He accused Anna Petrova of being a disgruntled employee with a personal vendetta against him. But his denials rang hollow. The evidence was too compelling, the witnesses too credible, the public outrage too intense. The tide had turned against him, and he was rapidly losing control of the situation. Gabriel Carter, armed with the court order and backed by a growing chorus of public support, entered Ravensbrück Penitentiary, ready to confront the darkness and bring the truth to light. The battle for justice had begun, a David versus Goliath struggle against a powerful and corrupt system. But Carter was confident, determined, and unwavering in his commitment to his clients, to the truth, and to the principles of justice and human dignity. The walls of Ravensbrück, once impenetrable, were about to be breached, and the secrets they held were about to be exposed to the world. The legal battle that ensued was fierce and protracted, a clash between the forces of justice and the entrenched power of the prison system. Gabriel Carter and his team faced an uphill battle, battling not only Warden Andrew and Dr. Ramirez, but also the bureaucratic inertia and institutional resistance of the Department of Corrections. Their first victory came with a court order, granting them access to Ravensbrück and the medical records of the pregnant inmates. This allowed them to conduct their own independent medical examinations, confirming Anna Petrova's findings and definitively proving that the pregnancies were the result of forced hormonal manipulation. Dr. Eleanor Vance, a highly respected endocrinologist brought in by Carter's team, testified to the specific cocktail of hormones used, their effects on the women's bodies, and the long-term health risks they faced. She condemned the procedure as barbaric, unethical, and a gross violation of human rights. The medical evidence, coupled with the testimonies of the pregnant inmates, who bravely recounted their experiences of abuse and coercion, painted a damning picture of the conditions inside Ravensbrück. They described the fear, the helplessness, the pain they had endured, the violation of their bodies and their trust. Warden Andrew, increasingly desperate, continued to deny the allegations, claiming that the inmates were lying, that they were part of a conspiracy to discredit him in the prison. He tried to smear Anna Petrova's reputation, portraying her as a disgruntled employee with a history of mental instability. But his efforts were futile. The evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses credible, and the public outrage growing. Sarah Matthews, the investigative journalist, played a crucial role in exposing the scandal. She published a series of articles in a major national newspaper detailing the abuses at Ravensbrück, the forced pregnancies, the cover-up, and the systemic failures that had allowed it to happen. Her articles sparked a national debate, prompting calls for prison reform, for greater accountability, and for an end to the abuse of power within the correctional system. Human rights organizations mobilized, staging protests, lobbying politicians, and demanding justice for the women of Ravensbrück. The legal battle moved forward on multiple fronts. Gabriel Carter filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of the pregnant inmates, seeking damages for their physical and emotional suffering and demanding an end to the abusive practices at Ravensbrück. The Department of Corrections, facing mounting public pressure and a growing legal threat, launched its own internal investigation. But the investigation was widely seen as a sham, a whitewash designed to protect the institution and its senior officials. The turning point came when a whistleblower, a former correctional officer at Ravensbrück, came forward with damning evidence. He had witnessed the forced injections, the intimidation of inmates, and the deliberate destruction of evidence. He provided detailed accounts of Warden Andrews' orders, Dr. Ramirez's actions, and a culture of fear and silence that permeated the prison. His testimony, coupled with the already overwhelming evidence, sealed Warden Andrews' fate. He was suspended from his position, pending a criminal investigation. Dr. Ramirez was also arrested, facing charges of assault, battery, and medical malpractice. The legal battle was far from over, but the tide had turned. The truth was out, the perpetrators exposed, and the wheels of justice were finally turning. The women of Ravensbrück, though still traumatized by their experiences, felt a sense of vindication, a sense of hope. They had been heard, they had been believed, and they were finally on the path to justice. The battle unfolded not just in the courtroom, but also in the court of public opinion. The media coverage, the public outrage, the activism of human rights groups all played a crucial role in bringing about change. The walls of Ravensbrück, once impenetrable, had been breached not by force, but by the power of truth, the courage of whistleblowers, and the unwavering commitment of those who refused to be silenced. The fight for justice was a long and arduous one, but it was a fight that had to be fought, a battle that had to be won, not just for the women of Ravensbrück, but for all those who suffered in silence within the hidden corners of the prison system. The courtroom was packed, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. Warden Harold Andrew and Dr. Edward Ramirez sat at the defendant's table, their faces pale and drawn, their legal teams flanking them, looking defeated. The jury had been deliberating for 3 days, and the tension was palpable. Finally, the jury foreman stood, his hand trembling slightly as he held the verdict form. He cleared his throat and began to read. On the charge of conspiracy to commit assault and battery, we find the defendant, Harold Andrew, guilty. On the charge of aggravated assault, we find the defendant, Harold Andrew, guilty. On the charge of official misconduct, we find the defendant, Harold Andrew, guilty. The verdict continued, listing count after count, each one ending with the same word, guilty. A gasp went through the courtroom, followed by a wave of murmurs, and then, finally, applause. The women of Ravensbrück, who had been present throughout the trial, wept openly, embracing each other, their faces a mixture of relief, joy, and lingering pain. Dr. Ramirez was also found guilty on multiple counts, including assault, battery, and medical malpractice. His medical license was revoked, and he faced a lengthy prison sentence. Warden Andrew was sentenced to 25 years in prison, a significant sentence that reflected the severity of his crimes and a profound breach of trust he had committed. He was immediately taken into custody, his reign of terror at Ravensbrück finally over. The aftermath of the trial was a period of reckoning and healing, of consequences and new beginnings. The Department of Corrections, facing intense public scrutiny and a wave of lawsuits, implemented sweeping reforms at Ravensbrück and other state prisons. They increased oversight, improved medical care, established independent grievance procedures, and invested in staff training on ethics and human rights. The pregnant inmates, now free from the control of Warden Andrew and Dr. Ramirez, were given the option of continuing their pregnancies or terminating them. Most chose to continue, supported by a team of compassionate doctors, nurses, and counselors. They were provided with proper prenatal care, counseling, and resources to help them prepare for motherhood. Maria gave birth to a healthy baby boy, whom she named Angel, a symbol of hope and new beginnings. Sarah, who had initially struggled with the idea of motherhood, found a deep and unexpected love for her daughter, whom she named Grace. Keisha, surprisingly gentle and protective, gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl, whom she named Justice and Liberty. Emily, overcoming her initial fears, embraced motherhood with a quiet determination, naming her daughter Faith. Jessica, with the support of specialized mental health care, was able to care for her son, Hope, learning to cope with her challenges and embrace the joys of motherhood. Anna Petrova, the whistleblower nurse, was hailed as a hero. She received numerous awards and accolades for her courage and her commitment to justice. She continued to work as a nurse, advocating for the rights of vulnerable patients and speaking out against abuse and neglect within the healthcare system. Gabriel Carter, the human rights lawyer, continued his work fighting for the rights of the oppressed and marginalized. The Ravensbrück case became a landmark victory, a testament to the power of the law to bring about justice and to hold the powerful accountable. The women of Ravensbrück, though forever scarred by their experiences, began the long and difficult process of healing. They formed a support group, sharing their stories, their pain, their hopes for the future. They found strength in each other, in their shared resilience, in their determination to rebuild their lives. The walls of Ravensbrück remained, a stark reminder of the horrors that had taken place within. But the atmosphere had changed. The fear and oppression had lifted, replaced by a sense of hope, of renewal, of justice served. The prison, under new leadership, was slowly transformed from a place of punishment and despair into a place of rehabilitation and healing. The story of Ravensbrück became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power, the importance of vigilance, and the enduring need for compassion and respect for human dignity. It was a story of pain and suffering, but also a story of courage, resilience, and the triumph of the human spirit. The reckoning had come, the consequences had been delivered, and the long, slow process of healing had begun, leaving behind a legacy of hope, justice, and a renewed commitment to protecting the vulnerable from the abuses of power. The 5 babies, born into a world of darkness, became symbols of light, reminders that even in the most horrific circumstances, life and hope can prevail.